Hello, welcome everybody. I am Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. It's great to be here with everybody as we acknowledge and remember the 40th anniversary of the Beirut bombings. We're a day away from the 40th anniversary, but I think we picked a good time. I don't know if that's the right word, but a good time to do this while terrorism is on everyone's mind, and look back and remember these things from the past and learn from them, and also acknowledge that even in the most horrible situations, there are inspirational acts that we can learn from, that we can move forward from, that we can grow from. And I think Rabbi Resnicoff's story has that inspiration in it. We have today as our moderator, Howard Mordman. Howard is the author of When Rabbis Bless Congress, which tells the story of American Jewish prayer in the Capitol. And a prominent figure in that book is Rabbi Resnicoff. He's done it more than anyone. Howard is the communications director for C-SPAN, the public service providing television coverage of the U.S. Congress. He's a veteran of Washington, D.C. media organizations. He has observed Congress from positions at MSNBC, National Journalist Hotline, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and New Media Strategy. Rabbi Arnold Resnicoff is a retired U.S. Navy chaplain. He's a life member of the Jewish War Veterans of the USA. A retired Navy chaplain, former National Director of Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee, and former Special Assistant to the Secretary and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force for Values and Vision. His naval career started in the rivers of Vietnam, followed by naval intelligence in Europe before rabbinical school and ordination. He was part of the small group of Vietnam veterans that worked to create the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and convinced the U.S. military to participate in the U.S. Days of Remembrance and of the victims of the Holocaust. He was the first chaplain to teach a course at a U.S. military war college, Faith and Force, Religion, War and Peace, at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He spent 25 years as a Navy chaplain, and recently he was one of 4 U.S. Navy chaplains honored at the Marine Barracks, recognizing his contributions to chaplaincy and the military as a whole. Welcome, Rabbi Arnold Resnicoff and Howard Mordman. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you all. And Mike, can we begin with the video, the short? Give us 1 second. We're going to open with a quick video clip of Ronald Reagan in 1984 speaking at the Baptists convention, and this will speak for itself, and then we'll go into the conversation. But as Mike cues that up, thank you all for joining us. The program is about, we have about 90 minutes for this. I want to do about 45 minutes of conversation with Rabbi Resnicoff, and then we'll take questions after that. But Mike, go ahead and play when you are ready.
I'm going to read to you another man's words, and they're words that perhaps answer what I said a moment ago about whether we sometimes were shaken in our faith and in our beliefs. On that October day, when a terrorist truck bomb took the lives of 241 Marines, soldiers, and sailors at the airport in Beirut, one of the first to reach the tragic scene was a chaplain, the chaplain of our 6th Fleet, Rabbi Arnold E. Resnicoff. And here is what he finally felt urged at the end of that day to put down in writing of the experiences of that day. He said, I, along with Lieutenant Commander George Pucciarelli, the Catholic chaplain attached to the Marine unit, faced a scene almost too horrible to describe. Bodies and pieces of bodies were everywhere. Screams of those injured or trapped were barely audible at first as our minds struggled to grapple with the reality before us. A massive 4-story building reduced to a pile of rubble, dust mixing with smoke and fire, obscuring our view of the little that was left. Because we'd thought that the sound of the explosion was still related to a single rocket or shell, most of the Marines had run toward the foxholes and bunkers, while we, the chaplains, had gone to the scene of the noise, just in case someone had been wounded. Now, as the news spread quickly throughout the camp, news of the magnitude of the tragedy, news of the need for others to run to the aid of those comrades who still might be alive, Marines came from all directions. There was a sense of God's presence that day in the small miracles of life which we encountered in each body that despite all odds still had a breath within. But there was more of his presence, more to keep our faith alive in the heroism and in the humanity of the men who responded to the cries for help. We saw Marines risk their own lives again and again as they went into the smoke and the fire to try to pull someone out, or as they worked to uncover friends, all the while knowing that further collapse of huge pieces of concrete precariously perched like dominoes could easily crush the rescuers. There was humanity at its best that day.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Rabbi Arnold Resnicoff, let's start big. Why were there American Marines in Beirut 40 years ago?
Well, it was because of the Lebanon War, Israel-Lebanon War, and the Marines had actually been in earlier, pulled out, and then there was a terrible massacre, Sabra and Shatila refugee camp. It was Christian militia that went in, and there was just so much fear that the war was going to expand to even larger areas. So American forces went in as one component of a multinational peacekeeping force. There were the French, the British, the Italian, and us. Now, our component had 1,300 men, mostly Marines, but not all. We also had some from the other branches, but that's the reason we were there. And in a way, it's sad, but to me, it's a remembrance of how the world has changed, because part of the reason we went in, I think, was that we thought that the warring factions would be so afraid to shoot over us, God forbid they might hit an American. Today, terrorists target Americans, but that was the idea. We were a peacekeeping force. Most of the Marines were young teenagers. I know a lot of my civilian friends, when they think of a Marine, they think of John Wayne in a movie. These were young teenagers. And, the rules of engagement, we were not supposed to fight. As a matter of fact, I don't want to go on and on for every question, but I remember there was a little club that was built where someone, could get a drink. And the original plaque said the Can't Fight Back Saloon. Then after the attack, it had changed to the Will Fight Back Saloon, and finally to the Did Fight Back Saloon. So we were getting more and more enmeshed, but it was supposedly a peacekeeping force. We were not there to be in combat.
Before we get to what happened 40 years ago in Beirut at the barracks, there was an attack on the embassy a couple of months prior.
Yes, that was in April. The significant thing about that was it was the greatest loss of life of CIA officers in one day in history, because, of course, there are CIA at the embassy. So that was a warning, but it was nothing like this attack on us. And, many scholars believe this was, it's been called the attack that launched our war on terror, because it was a major attack on U.S. military forces. And that was a first.
Okay. Let's go to what President Reagan described in 1984. Again, before we get to your part of the story, what happened that day 40 years ago tomorrow, October 23rd, 1983, that President Reagan described in Beirut?
Well, I'll start, if it's okay, with the reason he was reading my words. 4 days after the attack, then Vice President George H.W. Bush led a very small White House team to visit and to mourn with us, to show respect for the survivors. And one of the people that accompanied the team was the commander of the Sixth Fleet, and he was my boss. I worked for him. So he made sure to introduce me to the vice president, and the vice president said, when your mind clears, when you have a chance, write a report and send it to the White House. And so that's what I did. And I remember when I got a beautiful letter back from President Reagan, and he said, I hope you won't mind if I share your words with others. I showed that to my admiral, and he said, that means he's going to let Nancy read it. And then the next thing, we got the video from the White House, when you watch the video, I don't know if anyone recognized him, but to President Reagan's left was Jerry Falwell, and that was 20,000 Southern Baptists at Falwell's Baptist Fundamentalism 84. So Reagan decided, and I learned later from people in the White House, that Reagan just decided to read my speech, little change here and there, but basically none. And so that's how it came about.
All right. So what happened that day with the bombing that before you get there and that led up to your arrival in Beirut?
Well, the first Jewish Marine was killed. His name was Alan Seufert. He was from Nashua, New Hampshire. He was the fifth individual to be killed out of our 1,300 military personnel. He was in a Jeep inspecting the perimeter and got shot in the chest. So the colonel in charge of the Marines, Colonel Garrity, worked with the Sixth Fleet and with the governor of New Hampshire to get the body back as quickly as possible. As you know, Jewish law, we try to bury someone within 24 hours, but otherwise as quickly as possible. So they got the body back. As a matter of fact, the funeral already happened in New Hampshire before I arrived in Beirut. But because he was Jewish, the other Marines, and hardly any of them probably were Jewish, just out of respect for him, decided that a Jewish chaplain should lead a memorial service. The Marine unit, it was called a MAU, a Marine Amphibious Unit. Today, we would say MU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, had two chaplains, Protestant and Catholic, but I would visit periodically. So I was stationed on the flagship for the Admiral in Gaeta, Italy. And so they called me, and it was not so easy to get to Beirut. The airport was closed. So I had to go from Gaeta to Naples, fly to Sigonella, Sicily, which was our headquarters for marine aviation, from there to Cyprus, and then helicopters zigzagging, into Beirut. So by the time I got there, it was Friday.
So let me just interrupt. So again, this is for the memorial service, not even for the funeral. The funeral happened in New Hampshire, but your head memorial service to Beirut.
I just wanted, what turned out to be an interfaith memorial service. As a matter of fact, I had the Catholic and Protestant chaplains join me during the service for the 23rd Psalm, because we all said that was a country where every religion was gunning for every other religion. We wanted to show we were together. So we had that service, and it was a Friday. So Colonel Garrity said, tomorrow, Saturday, we'll start you on your journey back. You'll get at least to Cyprus. And I said, I don't travel on the Jewish Sabbath, Shabbat, so I'll wait till Sunday. That was the decision that put me in place when the attack happened 6:22 in the morning on Sunday. So it was only because I observed Sabbath that I was there. And of course, the Christian chaplains saw that as a sign from God, that because, every chaplain counted. So I was there because it was part of God's will, they told me.
At 6:22, as you said, the bomb happened. Were you awake when, or did the bomb wake you up?
Many of the teenagers, the Marines, were sleeping. I was actually brushing my teeth in, Navy would call it the head. I think Marines may call it the latrine, but I was brushing my teeth. And all of a sudden, the building shook. We threw ourselves to the ground. I threw myself to the ground, thinking, that a rocket or a mortar had hit the building. And then I crawled out, of the bathroom of the head. Everybody else was on the floor too. And slowly we were getting up. And I remember distinctly, we were slapping each other on the back and thanking God that we had made it, that the building had withstood whatever had hit us. We still thought something just had hit us. And then all these screams we could hear from not only the survivors and the wounded, but others who were on patrol who saw what happened. And we realized we had only felt the shock blast of this explosion. The building was a 4-story, massive building, reduced to rubble. And when the FBI investigated, they said it was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. It was actually, according to their investigation, lifted off the ground and then collapsed, and the two walls, went sideways, and almost everybody in that building died.
Okay, I want to pause this narrative for a second because now I want to go back into your bio and your experience in military combat zones. Give us a little bit of what what led you to the military and all. Then we'll pick it up on the other side of that.
My father was born in Russia. His father was a rabbi. My grandfather came over when my father was 3 years old, and so he was a very patriotic. He told me that every service that my grandfather led, he not only thanked God they made it to America, but thank God there was an America to make it too. And so my father didn't have a career in the military, but the day after Pearl Harbor, he quit his job and joined. And so he was always proud that he served. And since I was the oldest of three boys, he always raised me to think that I had to continue to pay our dues. He said, not for a career, but at least one assignment. So actually in high school, I already joined the Naval Reserves, switched to ROTC in college, and then straight from college went to the rivers of Vietnam. That started my career. I had Vietnam, then naval intelligence, but Vietnam changed my life because I had no intention of being a rabbi. In the rivers of Vietnam, we had a circuit ride. Most of the Navy people who say they were in Vietnam were off the coast in ships. We were actually in the rivers. We called ourselves the Brown Water Navy, and no individual unit had enough people for a chaplain. So there was a circuit riding Christian chaplain, an Episcopal priest, Les Westling, just passed away a few years ago. And so he would visit. And the first time he visited the ship after I had reported, he came up to me with my personnel card, and he said, "You're Ensign Resnicoff?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You're Jewish?" It was on the card. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You just volunteered to be the Jewish lay leader." So I always say I learned a lot from him about what it is to be a chaplain, to have your faith overflow and touch other people's spiritual journeys. But I also learned from him the military definition of volunteer, because every time he came over, I found I had volunteered for something else. Then I became the lay leader for the whole Mekong Delta. And as a matter of fact, the first Jewish thing I ever did as an adult for Yom Kippur, it was an island in the river, Antoy. He had me lead a service. He got the Jewish sailors and officers from all the units in the river. And, I had studied for bar mitzvah. I had celebrated a bar mitzvah. So I could go through a prayer book, Machzer, that had directions. So we led a service. So he became a good friend of mine. And he was the first one in my life who ever said to me, "You should consider being a rabbi." So I actually started writing to rabbinical school in New York, Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and kept corresponding with them. After Vietnam, I had to go to schools for intelligence, and then I went to work in Europe with intelligence. And when I got out, I went to the seminary and I met the dean of students, and he said, "I'm so happy to meet you because there are bets going on that you're not a real person." Every letter they got from me was from a different country. So they thought this might be some gigantic prank, but it wasn't. And I went for the interview and I got in. I don't know if you want to talk now or another time, but Abraham Joshua Heschel was actually on my interview committee. And he was on not by accident. He, of course, is famous for having stood side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. against racism and for civil rights, but he also stood with him against the war in Vietnam. And he admitted to me he had never met someone who had served in Vietnam, certainly not someone Jewish, so he wanted to be on my committee. Afterwards, we had coffee and we talked about Vietnam.
If we have time at the end, I want to go into that a little bit. That sounds really interesting. All right. So with that experience, let's now return to Beirut that morning. You said that the building lifted off the ground. What was with your experience in Vietnam, what was in your mind? Terror attack, under attack?
Well, yeah, we had no idea what was going on. It was a suicide driver in a van. We learned later, packed with explosives under gas pressure. hit us. And then as we, were reeling, just a couple minutes later, the French compound was hit in the same way. So we thought this might be an all-out attack, which is why a lot of the Marines took their positions. Not everybody was helping with the wounded, because we thought this was just the beginning of an attack. But what happened was there were two buildings about 75 yards apart. Whenever I would visit, and I had probably visited 10 times, my position on the 6th Fleet staff, I was one of 3 chaplains, a rabbi, a priest, and a minister. And we would cover all the ships in the 6th Fleet, which meant all the ships in the Mediterranean. It was a larger Navy back then, so we had approximately 40 ships at any given time. And so I'd go ship to ship to the Marines, ship to ship to the Marines. And when I visited the Marines, and it's important because not everybody understands the military, Navy chaplains are the only officers who can change our uniforms. Navy chaplains serve the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and even one at the Merchant Marine Academy. So that's why, I went with Marines. People ask me, how come a Marine chaplain didn't go? So anyway, so when I would go, I would alternate staying in the building with the Protestant chaplain or in the building with the Catholic chaplain. That time, I remember distinctly, it was my turn to stay with the Protestant, which was the building that was hit. But Father Pucciarelli said he had something he wanted to talk to me about. So I stayed with him, very likely saved my life. Danny Wheeler, the Protestant chaplain, what saved him was he was sleeping right next to the wall. So when the wall collapsed, he slid down. He was buried under the rubble for 5.5 hours. He was the last human being found and rescued. Since he had the space against the wall, if I were with him, I would not have had that space.
Mike, I'm going to pull up element number 7, picture of Rabbi Resnicoff in 1983, wearing the yarmulke before it gets bloody, if you could. And I think that brings us to what happens next. So and if it's perfect number. Yep. Okay. What are we looking at there, Rabbi Resnicoff? And
well, you can't. Okay, now you can see the yarmulke kippa is just like the one I have now. That's what I normally would wear. And there I was talking to a Marine in one of the bunkers, and the public relations people constantly went around and took photos. So that when he just happened to catch me speaking to a Marine in the bunker.
Okay, great. And so you're part of the rescue mission of there. I want to actually jump ahead. You told me something really interesting on the side earlier. You're a Kohen,
right? And
Kohens don't go into.
Kohens have special responsibilities. And a Kohen means priest, and the brother of Moses, Aaron, was the first priest. And according to Jewish tradition, all of his descendants through the male line Kohanim, priests, and we have certain responsibilities, including the fact that we don't go near dead bodies. So I think much of that probably came from the memories of Egypt, where the whole religion was focused on the death, focused on the mummies and the pyramids to keep alive and the afterlife. Judaism is the opposite. We bury very quickly, and then we concentrate on the memories and we concentrate on the mourners. So the Jewish priest wasn't even allowed to go near a dead body, with the exception of his own absolutely immediate family, brothers, parents, children. So in my whole life, I had only been in the cemetery 3 times, my father, my mother, and my brother. So I told you this, but most of my friends don't know this. So when I was in the habit of not even going into a cemetery near a grave, all of a sudden I had to be with a pile of bodies. So just on a human level, it probably was harder for me than if I hadn't been a Kohen.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So the title of today's discussion is the Camouflage Kippa. What does that mean? Bring us.
Well, so what happened was when we realized it was the other building that had been hit, and we rushed out to hit Father Pucciarelli. Pucci was his nickname, still is. He's still alive, thank God. Grabbed a little purple stole, put it around his neck, because he knew he was going to be giving last rites. And he said, "Follow me." So we ran out together. And I've said this many times, but I absolutely mean it. Until we ran out of our building, I never really understood what the expression "I couldn't believe my eyes" meant, because I literally couldn't believe my eyes. The building wasn't there. There was smoke and dust, from the explosion. I thought I was looking in the wrong direction, going in the wrong direction. All of a sudden, I started to focus, and that's when we saw so many wounded, so many dead. So sometimes people say 241 Marines were killed that day. I always correct them. It was 241 military personnel, 220 Marines, 18 Navy, 3 Army. And the reason it's important to mention the Navy is just like the Navy gives chaplains to help the Marines, the Navy gives medical personnel to help Marines. So we had a medical battalion, hardly more than the people who were killed. Almost everyone in our medical battalion, a doctor and all the corpsmen, we call medics corpsmen in the Navy, were killed. So not only didn't we have help, we didn't have any medical people to help us. So anyway, I don't know how long it took for medical assistance to come. Eventually, ambulances would come, helicopters from the ships would come with help. Seemed like an eternity. So all we could do was tear apart our clothes and wipe blood, wipe dirt, cradle people, say, help us on the way. So because I was brushing my teeth, I had a T-shirt and trousers on. So I took my T-shirt, kept ripping pieces, wiping people's faces. And then when that was gone, I took my Kippa and I wiped it. And it got bloody, it got dirty, it got lost. And that's when we had a chance to catch our breath. Father Pucciarelli came over to me and he tore a piece of camouflage cloth and he put it on my head. And I remember he was the hero. He said, here in this country where every religion is fighting every other one, I want our personnel to remember not only that the chaplains helped everyone, regardless of religion, regardless of whether they had a religion, but we did it side by side, Christian and Jew. He had a stole. He wanted me to have my head covered.
Mike, this is element 4, Rabbi Resnicoff wearing the yarmulke in Beirut, 1983, the cap, if I think this is the right one.
Yeah.
Is that okay? By the way, where do these photos come from?
These, almost all of the photos are official Navy or Marine Corps photos during my career. Right. And so, it's important to document. I think a lot of our, one of the other things I did during my career, Mike mentioned, was convince the military to be part of the Days of Remembrance of Victims of the Holocaust. And the reason I mention that is the first Holocaust remembrance was when General Eisenhower visited a liberated camp, Ohrdruf in Poland, and he said General Patton took one look, went outside and threw up and refused to go back in. But he called for photojournalists from America and Great Britain. And he said, we have to document this because otherwise the time will come when people say it's just propaganda. So this idea of documenting, so the military documents, and so whenever it's safe, people are taking pictures. So this is already when we're working in the rubble,
The timeline, this is still day one, or?
Yes.
This is still day
one.
Well,
I can't be 100% sure when the picture's taken, but day one, helping the wounded and getting people out from the rubble, it was only on day one. Then for the next 3 days, we were collecting pieces of bodies and putting them in body bags. And I actually thought to myself, and I put this in my speech that I sent to President Reagan, a lot of Jews don't obey the laws or traditions of Shiva. Shiva is, when you, after a death, the family sits together for 7 days and tells stories. And again, you have to admit the body's gone, but the memories will live. And one part of Shiva that a lot of Jews today either don't care about or don't observe is you're not supposed to talk to anybody except the mourners, and you're not supposed to talk to them unless they talk to you. So you go, you sit, you show by your presence that you comfort, and then if they start talking, then you talk and you tell stories. So that's the idea that I applied to all the Marines digging, because, they were digging, they were going through this terrible effort, finding pieces of people that were their friends. So I would go up to them, I would stand by them. If they started to talk, I engaged in conversation. Otherwise, I just wanted to be there supporting them.
I wanted to know the rescue, what you're describing right now, how many days did that operation go on? And are you wearing the camouflage kippa the whole time?
I'm wearing the camouflage kippa, and it's interesting. At that same time, Congress had been trying to pass it was called the Religious Apparel Amendment, to allow Jews in the military to cover their heads. When we were wearing the official Navy hats, your head was covered. But when you went to your office or the ship and you took it off, so we wanted to do that. It wasn't 100% no, but it was a struggle every time. Generally, a Jewish chaplain could do it. I never had a problem. But the reason I mention this is that for 2 years, it had failed to pass in Congress. It was going to get permission for what they called neat and conservative head covering. And when this story was told and put in the congressional record, it passed and began a whole long process of policies to allow religious exceptions to regulations. And the reason I mention that is the commandant of the Marine Corps had come with the White House team, P.X. Kelly, and he had been one of the ones against it because the Marines had this fear it was non-uniform. And I always said, uniformity is a means to an end. It's not the end. The end is unity. And we were unified in the sense that we were fighting for freedom, including a religious freedom, so that I like to see people, with different religious garb. Today, it's changed dramatically. So he and the senior enlisted person in the Marine Corps had both been against it, and they changed. And P.X. Kelly said, every time I see you from now on working with Marines, I hope you're going to be wearing that kippah. So yes, so I was there for 4 days. One day, we were really dealing with the wounded. 3 days, people were digging out remains. Then on the fourth day, P.X. Kelly, the commandant, invited me to leave with him. He was going to a hospital in Italy where a lot of the wounded Marines had been sent. So I went with him bed to bed when he pinned on Purple Hearts, and then I went back to Gaeta to where I was living.
Gotcha. Okay. And actually, Mike, forgive me, I want to go back because this leads to another question. To an earlier part of the story, can you pull up element 17? This is the picture. I'm going to go back to Rabbi Resnicoff, why he was in Beirut at all in 1983, the memorial service for Alan Sofert. And if you could show that picture, because I want to ask a question as we move on. So this is the memorial service in Beirut. This is where it all started.
Yes. So as we're looking at the photo, to the left is the Protestant chaplain, Danny Wheeler. As I said, he was the last one to be pulled from the rubble alive after being buried 5.5 hours. And to the right, as we're looking at it, that's Father George Pucciarelli. He's retired now, but his last assignment before he retired was as senior chaplain for the Marine Corps. So this story made him a legend, and he's wonderful. So both of them are still alive, thank God. I'm still in touch.
I want to ask you I went back to this as the rescue mission is going on, and as military personnel are being rescued. Are Jewish military personnel part of the 241 numbers?
As far as I know, the answer is no, but we can't be 100% sure. I think Seufert was the only one, which just makes it even more admirable, I think, that all the others wanted a Jewish service family. Now, if it's okay for me to jump to a story I had shared with you before, what's interesting is that it took 8 hours. Right now I'm divorced, but at that point I had a wife, and my daughter was 5 years old, I think. So at 6:22 in the morning, they got a phone call from my ship, the senior chaplain, to say, we don't want you to hear this on the radio, but there's been an explosion and we don't think your husband's hurt, but we'll keep you informed. So my ship, the Admiral ship, became the war room. The operations center became the war room, constant contact with the Marines. Now, by coincidence, my mother happened to be visiting, and my wife told me later that every time a phone rang, my mother had a heart attack. My wife was a good Navy wife. She kept saying, only worry if there's a knock on the door. If the phone rings, it's either going to be no news or good news. They're going to deliver bad news personally. So anyway, for 8 hours, so when my admiral finally saw me with the White House team, when he came 4 days later, he apologized to me. And this is a 3-star admiral apologizing for a little a junior officer. And my admiral had been a POW in Vietnam for years, so he was driven. He didn't want to miss a second. The first time I saw him show emotion, he apologized to me that he said, even though they were in touch with Beirut, he didn't know how to ask if his chaplain were alive when so many hundreds of others were dying. So what happened was a captain and his staff finally had the idea, I can proudly say it happened to be a Jewish captain, who had the idea how to ask the question, because sometimes how you ask is as important as the answer. He asked over the radio telephone to Beirut if, given all the casualties, all the wounded, if Rabbi Resnicoff was going to stay and help or if he was returning on schedule. And that's when they said, oh, he's helping, he's staying. And that's when they could call my family and say I was alive.
Mike, can you pull up element 10? This is the plywood sign for the peacekeeping chapel. And I'm going to have Rabbi Resnicoff describe what we're looking at in this picture.
Yeah, so we put up a little area where we could have services within the Marine compound, within the American compound. And that's the old symbol of the Navy Chaplain Corps, an anchor, and on one side, the cross that Christian chaplains wore, and on the other side, the 10 Commandments that Jewish chaplains wear. The symbol doesn't exist any longer because then we got Muslim chaplains, Buddhist chaplains, Hindu chaplains. So they started adding other faith insignia and finally said, we just need an insignia, with no faith group symbol so that it doesn't have to change. But anyway, so that's the old one. And I actually was the one who wrote in the Hebrew letters. When I came in the Navy.
And by the way, Rabbi, Mike, this is element 12 now, the picture of Rabbi Resnicoff, continuing the story, right? Element 12.
So you can see when I came in the Navy, the Jewish chaplain's insignia was what we call the tablets and star. You see the little Jewish star where the two tablets meet, but it was Roman numerals. In 1981, I was on the board that changed it or recommended it be changed to Hebrew letters. We said with all the problems the Romans gave the rabbis, they must be rolling over in their graves that we're using Roman numerals. Only Cecil B. DeMille used Roman numerals, in the movie 10 Commandments. So it was changed. So when we put this sign up in Beirut, I was the only one who knew how to put in the Hebrew letters, to symbolize the 10. Now you can see, this is the picture. You can see the top says peacekeeping, and the bottom, is chapel, U.S. Marines. The other photo you saw was after the explosion. Peacekeeping is still legible. The bottom, it's charred wood and burned. So I always say and above it symbolizes the dream of peace. The bottom, the reality of war.
Okay. We've done the first 4 days after the attack, and we opened with Ronald Reagan, 1984. Let's do a quicker timeline of anything related that you were involved in the Beirut explosion in those intervening times, reports, events you might have gone to in those between the bomb and the Reagan speech in 84.
Well, one of the most inspiring stories in military history when it comes to chapels chaplains is the story of the 4 chaplains. And a lot of people may not remember anymore, but at one point in World War II, everyone knew the story. There's a postage stamp at home, and I see it on the wall over here too. So anyone after this, take a look on the wall. It says immortal chaplains, and then the phrase I love, interfaith in action, because the story of the 4 chaplains, February 3rd, 1943, it was an Army troopship. 4 brand new Army chaplains, straight from chaplain school. The Army chaplain school at that point was at Harvard because of the war effort. The need for chaplains was so great. So the Army chaplain school went to Harvard. The Navy went to William and Mary. So it was a rabbi, a priest, and 2 ministers, brand new, right out of chaplain school. For those of you who live in Washington, the rabbi, also whose photo is on the wall, was Rabbi Good, who did his internship at Washington Hebrew Congregation. So these 4 chaplains, there were 900 and some men on the troopship. It was torpedoed by a German U-boat, a submarine. Over 600 people died, but many of the survivors told the same story, that all 4 chaplains gave up their life jackets to save somebody else. And then the 4 chaplains died together, ministering to the wounded and dying till the very end. So the reason I say that is because of your question. So there's a chapel of 4 chaplains in their honor in Philadelphia, 4 Chaplains Foundation, and they give an award every year to someone who personifies this interfaith in action. The first time they ever gave an award to more than one, to a Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant that reflected the original 4 chaplains, was to the 3 of us who had been in Beirut. So they flew us to Philadelphia. We had a ceremony. So that's one of the most memorable times. And they have an award called the Louis Paris Hall of Heroes Gold Medallion, and was given to a rabbi, a priest, and a minister in that year.
I have a couple more quick questions, then we'll get to audience questions. Do you consider yourself to be a survivor of a terror attack?
Yes. There were arguments at the beginning whether we could call this terrorism or not. It's interesting that my next assignment after Beirut, the chief of chaplains decided to send me to the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Again, a lot of civilians may know how this works, but the Navy has academies which give college degrees, West Point, Annapolis. But then there's a higher level institution, educational institution in each service called a war college. And that's where they're teaching officers who are on track to become flag or general officers, admirals or generals. Not everyone who goes to the war college becomes an admiral or general, but it's rare that someone becomes an admiral or general who did not go through the war college. So it was rare to have a chaplain go, never had a Jewish chaplain going. So the chief of chaplains decided I should go and do my thesis on ethical responses to terrorism, because, we were just grappling with the definition. Was this a terrorist attack? Because it was against the military. What did it mean? What's the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter? Someone like to use that level. So I went there and not only studied there, but after I was there, I was sent to the chaplain school, which is also Newport, and the War College invited me to teach a course. And I think it was mentioned in the introduction. So I created and taught the course, Faith and Force, Religion, War, and Peace. And we looked at the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and asked the question, what in each of these religions makes people want to fight, and what in each of these religions makes people want to make peace.
Have you been back to Beirut since?
I haven't. I almost had the chance just recently. 2 different people are making documentaries, film documentaries. One of them, Robert Mack, actually just came back from his 2nd visit to Beirut, and he said if he goes again, he's going to see if I can go with him. I would love to go back. Now, I had been to Beirut before, and it's the Paris of the Levant. It's a beautiful place, giant Ferris wheel on the beach, and I could see the degradation of the situation. Even the times I went to Beirut, because the first time I went, we were taken out so we could eat in town at a restaurant. There always was a Jeep behind us with people with weapons, just in case. Then after this attack, we weren't allowed to leave the compound. And slowly but surely, things got worse and worse until President Reagan ordered us out. But it was a beautiful place. I would love to have the chance to go back. By the way, I also would love to have the chance, and this I will one day, to go back to Vietnam, the Paris of the Orient, they used to call it. And, some of the most war-torn places in the world are the most beautiful places in the world.
What is in that spot now in Beirut where the Marine barracks were?
I talked to Robert Mack, and I got the impression from him, it's nothing, that, he still was able to see rubble. He's going, but I don't want to say that 100% with certainty, but that's my impression.
Mike, I want to show one more video and then have Rabbi Resnicoff react to it. This is element number 5. This is a video. Let it speak for itself. Other than the setup, this is October 20th, 2020. This is 3 years ago. To update our story, this is Rabbi Resnicoff. We mentioned that Rabbi Resnicoff has given many prayers in Congress, and here is a video during COVID of Rabbi Resnicoff giving a house prayer 3 years ago.
The house will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Rabbi Arnold E. Resnicoff, Chaplain, U.S. Navy, retired, Washington, D.C.
Almighty God, we pray, reflect in different ways, but together mourn our dead and tell their stories to keep their memories alive. 37 years ago today, I was in Beirut when a terrorist truck bomb attack took the lives of 241 U.S. military personnel. 58 French troops died a heartbeat later. A second truck, another deadly blast. They came in peace. They risked their lives to buy some time for change. Peace did not prevail, but their risk, their sacrifice must be honored and remembered. Their story must be told. Today, as we recall and honor Beirut dead and Beirut vets in a special way, we mourn all those we've lost to war, to hatred, and disease as well. Lord, may we heed your call, together to choose life, to work for, fight for life, a better life for those who one day will remember us. And may we say, Amen.
Amen.
Heard Rabbi Resnicoff mention disease. As I said, that was during COVID. It just struck me listening to that. I hadn't picked up on this earlier. Twice in that prayer, you mentioned telling stories, the need to tell stories. How often do you tell this story of what happened in Beirut 40 years ago, or have you told? And are people interested in this story?
I've told it many times. Whenever I am invited to explain the role of a chaplain, I include this story. I include the story of the 4 chaplains. One of the first chiefs of chaplains that I had when I was a junior chaplain, and I should say, some countries have one, like Israel has one chaplaincy, one chief of chaplains. Most countries have different chaplaincies based on religion. So there's a Protestant chief of chaplains, a Catholic chief of chaplains. We have them by service. So there's an Army chief of chaplains, Navy chief of chaplains, Air Force chief of chaplains. As I said, the Navy helps the Coast Guard and the Marines. Space Force, which is our newest branch, the Air Force treats them like the Navy treats the Marines. So they don't have Space Force chaplains. Air Force chaplains help them. So I often am asked to explain the role of him, because I have a lot of civilian friends that are surprised even to hear that I work with non-Jews. Israel, when I got friendly with chaplains, when my ship would go into Israel, they were amazed that I would work with non-religious Jews. So, American chaplaincy is a really a miracle. And the reason I was starting to mention Navy Chief of Chaplains was John O'Connor, who's now John Cardinal O'Connor. He was the Archbishop of New York before he passed away. He told me after he retired from the Navy as Chief of Chaplains and first went to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and then to New York, he said he's learned that civilian clergy, when it comes to interfaith respect and cooperation, talk about what Navy chaplains do. So he said it's not a negative reflection. They just have so busy. They're overwhelmed with their own congregations. In the Navy, hardly a day went by that I didn't work with someone of a different religion, or that chaplains together would work with people of different religions.
Mike and Logan, I'm going to ask one more question, give you a chance to set up for audience questions. I'm going to ask this question. I would imagine it's looming, and I would imagine it's on everybody's mind right now. Here's my attempt at this question. You're not here as a military analyst. You're not here as a policy analyst. You're not an expert. That's not what you've done. You have survived, though, a terrorist attack. Against that prism of your own experience, how did you react 2 weeks ago to what happened in Israel?
Horror. I'm sure every American, or most Americans, were horrified. Military veterans, maybe a little bit more, because we've been in situations where our lives were at risk, but absolute horror. And also, I could identify with the Israelis who felt they had been let down by their military. I can imagine, that feeling as well. Now, military can't anticipate everything. A lot of times we make mistakes as well, but it was just such an unbelievable attack and atrocities and people, dying. So I think that, I just relived the experience in Beirut, but then just switched, to the comfort mode that I would have as a chaplain, but long distance. Now, I was in touch email, I've been on Zoom calls, but I've just tried to offer my prayers. But it's just a terrible, terrible time.
Let me add one postscript. You mentioned being in contact with colleagues. Are there places that people who want to learn, watching on Zoom, want to learn more about what happened 40 years ago? Any resources you recommend, memorials, who want a deeper history of what happened in Beirut?
Well, up until now, you can Google and see different articles. But as I mentioned, two separate individuals are making documentaries. And then in 2024, there's going to be a new book, a very, very important book coming out. Two world famous authors, Jack Carr, who's famous for a lot of fiction, intelligence books, and James Scott, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner as an historian, together are writing the book Targeted, the attack that launched our war on terror. And as James Scott, one of the things about the book is going to have a lot of information never revealed before, because James Scott is working with classified documents. So just to give you an example, I had never known until he sent it to me that the White House team, one of the people on the team had sent a cable to the White House Situation Room, reporting what he had seen to help Reagan's first remarks. And when it was written, it was classified, confidential, which is the lowest rank of classification, but it was officially declassified. And it talked about the fact that three chaplains gathered together to give the prayer, although the person, Ed Hickey, who sent it, just heard that story. But it also talked about my working with Kippa on my head, and that's something he saw. So I think this is going to be the definitive book, at least so far. So remember, Targeted, Jack Carr, and James Scott.
Okay, great. My apologies to the audience. I ran over in my question time. I'm going to look to our friend and colleague Logan and Mike, who is manning the Zoom. If there are any questions we can take from the audience here.
We can start with one from Zoom. Can you expand on your relationship with Father Pucciarelli, both before the incidents in Beirut and after?
Well, before we were fellow chaplains, when I would go, as I said, ship to ship and then to Beirut, it was to fill in the gap, to add another chaplain, but it also ended up being, I don't want to be presumptuous and say I was a chaplain to the chaplains, but in some ways I was coming from the Admiral staff. I could fill them in on things that were happening, but also, they were so busy working with their troops, they could talk to me. So we became fast friends. Since then, I've only seen him once. The 35th anniversary of the bombing, the White House had a ceremony, and he and his sister were able to come for that. But I've been in touch both with him and with Danny Wheeler, email. And I also recently saw a clip, an interview with him for one of the documentaries being made. I love him. Those two chaplains, it sounds trite to say they're my brothers, but they're my brothers. By the way, if I can add one thing, when I talk about interfaith, for many clergy and for many academics, it's a academic idea. Number one, I wouldn't have been a rabbi, as I told you, if it hadn't been for a Protestant chaplain, an Episcopal priest. But not just that, I was never stationed where there were other rabbis. So when I had a personal tragedy, when my brother died, when my father died, it was other chaplains who comforted me, and never a Jewish chaplain. So interfaith, diversity, dreams. And one of the things I learned when I taught the course on religion, war, and peace, I said that when I grew up, a lot of teachers used to say to me, all religions are basically the same. It's really not true. It's not true that all religions are completely different either. There are overlaps. But when you think of the end of days, the vision of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, they're not only different, they're mutually exclusive. They can't all survive. So what I figured out from that course, the secret of the chaplaincy is the more we concentrate on the end of days, the more we disagree. But the more we concentrate on the end of today, to make today a better day for those in pain, for those afraid, for those lonely, homeless, the more we can roll up our sleeves and work together. And I think that's the secret of the chaplaincy. We hardly ever talk theology. We just roll up our sleeves and help other human beings.
Hi, I'm a retired historian, and I do a lot of work now with National History Day. So after 9/11, when I had students coming to me with topics for projects, they wanted to do terrorism, and I directed them actually to the Beirut bombing. But with 20 years out, there wasn't as much information available as it to really explain. So I'm very, very glad to hear of this thinking and the work that you're doing and your colleagues are doing to emphasize the aspect of terrorism on the American side, because I really think that will inform students going forward. They really don't have a lot of resources, the high schoolers of today, to really understand that this is not just 9/11 and it's just not in Israel, that this story goes back and you have to untangle it in various ways. So please let the folks that you're dealing with know that the students today really need to know and are going to appreciate the philosophical and underpinnings of all of this story.
And I would say all of you, whatever congregations you're in, whether it's Jewish or not Jewish, on Memorial Day, on Veterans Day, invite a chaplain to speak, help to educate, because the schism between civilian world and military world is greater than I ever saw. My father's generation, everybody was a veteran, the school teachers, the newspaper people. Today, it's almost like the military is a family business, because so many people in the military have a parent who was in the military or a close cousin. And so many people don't have any relative in the military and don't know anyone in the military. And, it's interesting when you say 9/11, I remember after 9/11, a lot of people were using the expression, this is a wake-up call for America. Those of us in Beirut said, that's the snooze alarm. The wake-up call was Beirut.
We have one online from Brad Washabaugh. What can be said to the survivors and families of the killed to help ease their grief even after 40 years?
Because Judaism deals so much with memories, I don't know people, if you can ease their grief by trying to, say we certainly don't say in Judaism they're in a better place. We don't try to, all we can do is say, thank God for their lives and thank God for the people they touched. It's interesting when there's something in the military called survivor's guilt, that a lot of times when there's a terrible situation, people who don't die feel guilty, almost as if they've let their comrades down. And so one of the decisions I immediately made in Beirut after the explosion was that I tried to attack that feeling, and I tried to tell the survivors they were the chosen. They were chosen to carry on the memories of what happened and the people that died. So they each had to live harder, to tell the stories and to help their comrades be remembered. So today we are remembering more. Of course, the 40th anniversary helps us remember. But, I would just say to the survivors or to the people whose relatives died, just love them. Love the fact that they lived. Love the fact that you remember them, because so many people died who are not die in the world who are not remembered. So give thanks that you are remembering them, and that they're, the Jewish expression is, may their memory be for a blessing, so that the memory of these people who died will bless you, that you'll work harder for a world that won't have terrorism, that won't have war.
I've got another one from Zoom, from Nelson Melitz, the immediate past national commander of Jewish war veterans. Did the Lebanese assist in the rescue and recovery? Also, I understand there is a monument to U.S. troops near the bombing site. Is that correct?
I recently heard that there was a monument. I'm not sure of exactly at the bombing site, but there is a monument. Now, in America, our big monument is in Jacksonville, North Carolina, outside Camp Lejeune, because most of the Marines who died came from Camp Lejeune. And as a matter of fact, tomorrow, for the 40th anniversary, there's going to be a major ceremony. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be on C-SPAN, but it's going to be on YouTube. It's 10:30 tomorrow. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Secretary of the Navy will be there showing respect. So 10:30 tomorrow, I'm certainly going to be watching on television, and I'd recommend it. So again, the Robert Mack, who just came back from Beirut, said there was some kind. Now in Israel, the woman, Gila Gerzon, who was in charge of the USO, and one of the things I'm proud of, I helped convince the USO to start one in Israel. When we were in Lebanon with the multinational force, we were trying to be neutral when it came to the fight between the Lebanese and the Israelis. So we didn't have ships go into Israel. Once the explosion happened, America basically said, the heck with neutrality, and we started pouring ships into Israel. Many of these ships had been off the coast for months at a time. They went into Israel, and just as a matter of trivia, for those of you who know Israel, and many Israelis won't know this, we transformed Haifa. There used to be an expression, you pray in Jerusalem, you play in Tel Aviv, and you pay in Haifa because it's just commerce. And even though it's physically beautiful, there was no Israeli would go on a vacation. All of a sudden, thousands of U.S. sailors went into Haifa. One aircraft carrier can have up to 6,000 people, and they don't operate alone. There's a battle group like the two we just sent, because of this terrible war. So thousands of sailors. So discotheques opened, bars opened, all kinds of places open, and now it's a place for Israelis to go also. So, it's just kind of a trivia memory.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your talk today. It's obvious you supplied so much support to the military members while you were there and afterwards. What I'd like to know is, you mentioned there was a lot of change in the military with the chaplaincy in the 40 years since. Now that you are an expert in chaplaincy, you're retired, so now you can really speak your mind. What further changes would you like to see that they haven't done yet?
I actually have been rediscovered in the military a little bit. After a lot of years, I'm old enough that people want to hear my opinions. So I've been, the Navy chaplain school is Newport, I mentioned. So I've actually, every couple months, I either go up to give a course or I have a Zoom call. And, I'm impressed. The biggest change, is in what the military used to call religious accommodation, starting with Kippa in Beirut. Now we've just graduated from Marine boot camp, the first Sikh who has a full turban and a full beard. And I have to tell you a quick story about the Kippa. As I said, when I was a junior chaplain, it wasn't 100% forbidden. It just was a struggle. So I remember when I was in Japan, my first chaplain assignment, a young sailor came to me and he said, "Rabbi, chaplain, I'm not so religious, but I'm engaged to someone who is. She wants me to be more observant, and she would like me to start wearing a yarmulke." We didn't say kippah in those days. And so I said to him, I happen to have in my drawer an ornate, beautiful Moroccan, yarmulke. And I said, when you go back to your ship and you take your hat off, put this on. He said, "Chaplain, that's going to make it so much harder." And I said, those famous words, "Trust me." So I said, as a chaplain, I not only need to know rabbinic issues, I need to know the psychology of the military. So he went back probably 2 minutes after he got to the ship and he took his hat off and put this on. The captain of the ship called me, said, "Chaplain, we have a problem. Is there any way you could come talk to me on my ship?" So I went to talk to him. And it's interesting, in the Navy, in the military, you wear your resume on your uniform. So immediately someone looking at me could tell I was a regular officer before I was a chaplain, could tell I had been in a war in Vietnam. So immediately he treated me with a little more respect than just a junior rabbi that he had called on the phone. So he said to me, he used an expression we wouldn't use today because it's not appropriate any longer, PC, but I'll tell you because it's in my ears. He said, "I believe in religious freedom as much as anyone in this man's Navy." That's the expression. We wouldn't say anymore. But he said, "There's no way Seaman Schwartz is going to wear that beanie on my ship." So I looked at him with respect and I said, "Captain, what if I could convince him just to wear a little black one like I wear instead of that?" He said, "If you can do that, no problem." But of course, if he had started with this, it would have been a different discussion. So we had a lot of fights to fight for the different kosher food, days off, a lot of things that used to be major problems. I won't say that they're easy now, but they're achievable and doable. And I was involved a lot along the way. I don't know if I should go criticize the military in public and a recording. So I'll tell you afterwards when I have.
Rabbi Resnicoff, actually, I want to interject, Mike, for a second. I should have asked this question earlier, and I can't believe I didn't. But let me, on behalf of people in the audience on Zoom or here, don't know what a yarmulke is or kippah and why this is significant. This is probably the element most important to the story. Why are we even talking about a yarmulke today?
Traditional Judaism, and traditionally it was a man, wear your head covered. It didn't matter exactly what it was covered with, but it was to show that you were not the top of everything. There was something above you. It was a reminder, like so many commandments are, that you're not God. And so a simple reminder like that. So again, like I say, in the military, I think when we were fighting for Yarmulke, people had this image where there'd be people marching, with the Navy hats, and then all of a sudden just this, but that doesn't happen. But anyway, so that's, they're actually, and I know you know this story, coincidentally, the day that, either the day or the day before that President Reagan was going to be given this speech, a Chabad group visited his office. And as they were leaving, because they had a very small amount of time, and I think they were actually presenting a menorah, but he stopped them and they said they were surprised. And he said, I just want to let you know, I know that thing that you wear on your head is called a kippa. And he said, I'm going to give a speech about a kippa. And he told them the story, of the chaplain in Beirut that had a camouflage kippa.
Actually, if I could for a moment add one personal element to that story. I know that story personally, as Rabbi said, because of the work I did on rabbis praying in Congress. A Lubavitcher rabbi who prayed in Congress called me up to say hello and thank me for including him in the book. And he told the story without knowing Rabbi Resnicoff or my connection to Rabbi Resnicoff. And he's in a heavy, thick Yiddish accent. He's saying how great Ronald Reagan was in that meeting. And Ronald Reagan even brought the story of a rabbi who was in Beirut and wore a camouflage kippa in as many words, but didn't know your name. But I heard that story from a participant in that meeting the day before the 1984 speech. So it was pretty amazing. Okay, Mike.
And by the way, I will say, I did mention it. When I came in, there were just Jewish and Christian chaplains, Protestant and Catholic. But now we have Muslim chaplains. There's been one Hindu chaplain. We have Buddhist chaplains. And I'm positive in the future there will be others. One of the applicants the only, if you want to call it, it's not exactly a faith group, but a group that has been turned down are atheists. Some universities have atheist chaplains or humanist chaplains. I think the senior chaplain at Harvard now is in that category. Some countries have humanist chaplains like Norway. America so far has said no, but there's a reason, and I think this is important. I mentioned to you before that American chaplaincy is a different model than many other countries. We have a three-pronged responsibility as chaplains. We learned this from the beginning in chaplain school. In addition to advising the command on issues, we minister to our own, which means I'll always be a rabbi for Jews. We facilitate ministry to those of other faiths, which means I won't lead a Catholic service, but I'll make sure a Catholic service is held. I'll make sure we get a priest or a lay leader. I'll make sure we get rosaries. I'll make sure there's a prayer rug for a Muslim. And the third is we care for all. In the American military, there's only one person who has 100% privileged communication, confidentiality. That's a chaplain, even more than a psychiatrist or a doctor who have large privilege, but not complete. So many people who come to us will have no claim, no religion, but they want a sounding board. They want a comfort. And other countries where a chaplain often will only work with people of his or her faith, that leaves the gap, leaves people with no religion. So they need maybe a humanist chaplain. We don't if we do our jobs. By the way, a quick story, because I like to humanize this. I remember distinctly when I was in Norfolk, Virginia, a young sailor came in to me and said, I'm running away tomorrow. The Army calls it going AWOL. We say UA, unauthorized absence. Now, I knew he wouldn't be telling me if there were not some hope in his heart that I would talk him out of it, talk to him about it. And so I said to him, and when I teach at the chaplain school, I always say, You have to decide if it's a moment to preach or a moment to teach. I said, our first instinct is to preach, but sometimes we don't need to do that. I didn't need to preach about he had taken an oath and he owed it to his comrades. Instead, I said, look, I'll be honest with you. If you run away, the FBI is not going to sick the dogs on you. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you may be married, you may have children, they'll run you through a computer. If you go through a stop sign or a red light, they'll find out you're a deserter and your life will come crumbling down. I said 2 things. First, take my phone number. If you do run away, if you want to come back, call me anytime, day or night. I will make sure that we bring you back. Secondly, though, I said, nobody really hates the entire military. What is it, that's making you so unhappy? Is it a person? Is it a job? Is it a position? Let's see what we can do. Maybe we can make some changes. So people come to chaplains because they know they can come off the record. They don't want it on their file, on their record that they saw a psychiatrist. But they come to a chaplain. So an American military chaplain, has 1 foot in the civilian world and 1 foot in the military world. And we are much more important than most civilians can even imagine.
Mike, I think if we have one more from Zoom, we have time.
Yeah.
One more from the audience.
Gary Ginsburg asked, can you comment on the presence of women chaplains and rabbis in the military today, which I do not recall in the 1970s and 80s?
Well, the first woman chaplain in the military was Diana Pullman Bell. I could have a year off one way or the other, but I think around 1971, I think Mike mentioned in the introduction that the Marine Barracks parade, which is every Friday night during the summer. If any of you have not been to the Marine Barracks for a summer parade, go, go, go. But for the first time, they dedicated one to Navy chaplains, and they picked 4 chaplains representing the history of the chaplaincy. I was one, and this Diana Pullman Bell was one as the first woman Navy chaplain, and she was the first chaplain in the whole military. Shortly after, the other services took women too. Admiral Zumwalt, who's a legend in the Navy, he was the head of all forces in Vietnam when I was there. And then he became the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations. He personally pushed to change the regulations to allow women in the chaplain corps and the supply corps. Those were the 2 that didn't have women. And then he swore Diana Pullman Bell in himself. So, when I tell the story of the 4 chaplains that went down on the Dorchester, and I mentioned was a rabbi, 2 ministers, and a priest, all white men, I always use that as a foundation or an opportunity to describe how the chaplaincy has changed. Today, the odds that all 4 of them would have been men and white are so small. The odds that one of them would have been another race, would have been a woman, are astronomical. So today you just cannot see chaplains without appreciating the diversity. I think that answers the question.
Mike, do we have more Zoom questions or do we have one more? Let's say, I'm sorry, take an in-person question, please.
Hi, Rabbi, how are you? This is a personal question, but let me give you a little background. And in an instance, I was on active duty, retired from the Air Force Reserve, and then I joined the Foreign Service with the U.S. Agency for International Development. One of my colleagues was in the bombings in Beirut the few days before where you were, if you remember, when it was bombed earlier. And there was a very large, because of the number of people and so many CIA and USAID and other government from the embassy who were there, a very large memorial service at National Cathedral. Shortly after that, which I went to, shortly after that, I was home with family, and I told them that if that ever happens, and unfortunately in that situation killed, I don't particularly want to go at National Cathedral. Put me in a synagogue. And if people want to come and pay their respects, that's fine, but I'm not really interested in it. Never talked about that when I was in the military, but with being in USAID and being in developing countries for so long, anything can happen. I know what you said about interfaith. Have you ever thought of something similar as it would relate to yourself? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. By the way, this is Rick Soloway, a friend of mine, and a career that's amazing. If there were church services that honored the dead in Vietnam, in Beirut, including Seufert, the Jewish Marine, I would have no problem with that personally. I hope I would not be included. I hope I'm still alive. But one thing I've learned, working so closely with diversity and interfaith, you have to always look for the words behind the words that are spoken and the intent of the actions that are done. For instance, Howard asked me, if you notice the prayer in Congress, Nancy Pelosi as the speaker, always after the prayer, no matter who gives the prayer, crosses herself. And by the way, the guest chaplains in Congress, there's an official House chaplain, official Senate chaplain. Both happen to be retired Navy chiefs of chaplains. I'm proud of that. But the guest chaplain, the one who gives the prayer, if they don't, for whatever reason, they've been Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, of course, Native American, just the whole gamut. And it's a reminder that there's no established religion. So Howard asked me how I feel about Nancy Pelosi crossing herself after my Jewish prayer. And I think she's showing respect. She's showing reverence based on her religion. So I don't even remember how I felt before I went in the military, but I think now, I mentioned before, for someone Jewish, you don't say the person you've lost is in a better place. But if someone says that to me, I say, in my mind, I switch and say, what are they doing? What are they saying? They're saying they're trying to comfort me. They're sad because I lost someone. So I do the translation in my mind. So for ceremonies or for personal words, I translate. That's part of communication. So if God forbid, I had been killed there and there were ceremonies in different places, I think I would have looked down and said, if that makes my family proud that I'm being remembered, then amen.
Mike,
Yeah, we can wrap up.
Okay. I want to ask one final question. But first, I really want to thank Mike and Logan and the audience in the National Museum of American Jewish Military History for an amazing discussion. Of course, thanks. Well, I'm going to ask two questions. My boss, Brian Lamb, who's in the Navy, does not like the term "thank you for your service." Is it? What are your thoughts on on saying thank you for your service after I thank you for your presentation today? Then I have a second question.
It's an excellent question. Some people are tired of it as if it doesn't matter. But again, let me tell you, when I came home from Vietnam, nobody thanked us for our service. That's one of the reasons we fought to build the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, because people saw no daylight, no distinction between how they felt about a war and how they felt about the war fighters, those who were drafted and those who were sent. So I correct people when they say we have a Vietnam War Memorial. We don't. It was very specifically named the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and it was not going to be a memorial to glorify the war. And it was not going to be a memorial to say the war was a mistake and glorify the protesters. And people on both sides wanted that. And the reason I say that is whenever I go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, instead of saying thank you for your service, what we say, and if you know someone from Vietnam, we say welcome home, because we were not welcomed home. So again, if someone says to me, thank you for your service, I have all these memories. I would just say thank you, and I would appreciate it.
Okay, last question from me, and then thank you to everybody who came out today and joined us. The story today, Camouflage Kippa, your story in Beirut 40 years ago, is it a Jewish story, a religious story, a military story, an American story, or all of the above?
I think all of the above. It certainly changed the regulations in the military, changed the way people looked. But I do think that the fact that it was a priest who created the camouflage kippah, that he was the hero of the story. It was my head, but it was his vision. And so the idea that there was a rabbi, a priest, and a minister there, we served in different ways, we were affected in different ways. I hope above, it's a religious story because of so many of the religious elements. The fact that I wouldn't have been there except that I observed Shabbat. I wouldn't have been there except that so many non-Jewish Marines wanted a Jewish memorial service for their comrade. So I think in that way, it's an American story because America is unique. I'm not saying that we don't have problems, and I shiver at the extremists today, but when it works, there's no country like America. But if I can add with one final note, I recently wrote an article, and you can Google. It was published in the Times of Israel, but it's called "Open When I Die: My in-Progress Ethical Will." My daughter, who's my greatest fan and severest critic, said she liked that better than anything I've ever written. And it's a link because what happened is when we were gathering things that were left after the explosion, we came across different things, but a couple times we found envelopes that had written on them to be opened in case I die. And it reminded me, there's a Jewish tradition of an ethical will that in addition to a physical will where you decide who gets what in property, there's an ethical will where it's your final chance to tell stories and to give lessons, based on your lives. So I wrote this, and I would really recommend if anyone wants to learn a little bit more, including some of the stories I think are the most important in terms of lessons that I've learned. Again, it's Open When I Die, Times of Israel. I'm sure you'll be able to find it.
Thank you all. Mike, do I turn it over to you now?
Yeah, I just wanted to read one final comment. Malka Zief, I accept, love, and appreciate that description. So thanks everyone for coming. We will sign off now. We do have Howard's book for sale. I just should have mentioned that earlier when Rabbis Bless Congress. And thank you so much for being here.